I am the mixed-race daughter of a mixed-race mother, almost given away for her blackness. In the 1940s, my maternal grandmother, Lucrecia, was a mixed-race country girl, or what her fellow Puerto Ricans called a jíbara, from a mountain village in Puerto Rico. Her African ancestry appeared slightly in her trigueña, that is light, wheat skin color tone. It's not a very good translation, but some things just can't be translated very well, right? So her trigueña, light skin tone, but was not very apparent in her facial features or her hair texture. Her older sisters were similarly light-skinned and favored their fair-complected mother more than their darker-skinned father. For this reason, Lucrecia and her sisters considered themselves a race apart from those who appeared more unambiguously Afro-descendant. Any tinge of color in the family was attributed to the long-ago legacy of Taino Indians on the island. It was immaterial to the family that Taino Indians have been historically documented to have been exterminated by the Spanish conquerors by the mid-16th century. When my grandmother Lucrecia fell in love with and united herself with a carpenter and guitarist named Juan, her family was not pleased. While he himself was a mixed-race grandchild of a former slave and a son of an Afro-Puerto Rican mother and white Spaniard, his appearance was what Lucrecia's family labeled as black, and thus unacceptable. Puerto Rican identity may claim to celebrate racial mixture, but some of us are thought to look more mixed than others. Dark skin deviations from the idealization of light skin with European features and straight hair are ejected from the Puerto Rican portrait of racial mixture. Lucrecia's family was no exception from this Puerto Rican and similarly Latin American anti-black conception of racial mixture. Lucrecia's second child, Nina, my mother, was born in the 1940s, and much to the dismay of Lucrecia's family, to them the child was dark, too dark to count as racially mixed, and certainly too dark to pass as a white Puerto Rican. Baby Nina did not pass the look behind the ears test that the people in the Caribbean use to seek out the future darkness of infants. Even more problematic, Nina's skin tone, approximating that of 1940s African-American singer and actress Lena Horne, perhaps the Beyonce of her time for the millennials in the room, would complicate the family's image as disassociated from blackness. The campaign to send baby Nina away began in earnest. Lucrecia's family lobbied to have baby Nina placed for adoption with an African-American family. Any African-American family would do, so long as baby Nina was removed from the household. Only later, as an adult researcher, would I learn from a colleague how much the family impulse resembled the dynamic of returning foster children like damaged goods in Puerto Rico when they become too dark. At the same time, the family's animus towards the Afro-Puerto Rican father that baby Nina favored did not extend to her older sister, Monica. Monica was lighter in complexion with long, straight hair. Monica's African ancestry did not announce itself so loudly in her appearance, and she was immediately accepted by the family. The physical comparisons between the two sisters was a constant obsession of the family, with Nina being called Monito, little monkey, and Negrita Bembe, little African-like girl, while Monica was lovingly called La Nena, the little girl. Nina's darker skin tone and African tresses were always viewed as problematic by the family. Her kinky curls, her pelo malo, bad hair, was a source of consternation that compelled Lucrecia to continually shave baby Nina's hair in the hope that it would grow out straighter. I told you she was a country girl. Any infraction of Lucrecia's rules of discipline were greeted with both a beating and expression of regret for not having given her away to an African-American family at birth. along with the threat to place Nina in a foster home. Again, this was a marked contrast to the indulgence accorded her older sister Monica, with the slightly lighter skin and the, importantly, straighter pelo lindo, pretty hair, or as we like to say in the United States, good hair. She had that good hair. Okay. The racialized distinctions between the two girls continued their entire lives. My own childhood experience with differential treatment based on how mixed or black I was perceived to be on any given day was a context that only reinforced my understanding of the relevance of anti-black sentiment within celebrations of idealized notions of mixture amongst Puerto Ricans and others. My grandmother Lucrecia was never happier than when my hair was greased down into 2 long braids down my back, and I looked as what she envisioned or fantasized an indigenous Taína Puerto Rican would look like. Her absolute preference, though, was for me to have my hair blow-dried straight, regardless of how short in duration that look would last. The curly girls in the room will know, right? One day in humid weather, right? Or maybe a week with the aid of large rollers, dry air, and a nightly wrapping of the scalp, right? With a scarf for maximum stretch. Right? However, the hair wars began in earnest when I cut off my hair for this stylish bob that you see before you now. Right? My grandmother was mystified as to why I would choose to have my curls spring out on display. When I first cut it, it was very, very short, so it resembled my mother's afro. In my grandmother's eyes, my mother was unfortunately afflicted with overtly bad hair, but why in the world would I choose to emulate that style when she thought I had the benefit of being better situated to beat my hair into submission with what she thought was a more attractive simulation of whiteness? Every visit to her apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan was greeted with some version of, ay, ese pelo, oh, that hair. ¿Por qué no haces algo con ese pelo? Why don't you do something with that hair? Wearing my hair in a short, curly style here also worked to seemingly eject me from my presumed membership in the Latino imaginary. Encountering Latino, or as young people say, Latinx, merchants and other Latino service providers, I was now constantly greeted with a surprise. Oh, you speak Spanish? Where did you learn to speak Spanish? My hair now barred the door to my automatic entree to Latino kinship. I now had to earn my way back into Latina-is by constantly speaking Spanish loudly and reinforcing my Latina culture. Like in Latin America, the imagined Latino community in the US had and has a decided vision of mixture that does not encompass tightly coiled hair with brown skin. The anti-black slurs I heard used in the Latino community with respect to African Americans only reinforced my early impressions that blackness was problematic, despite our assertions of a Latino pride in being a mixture of all races. It became evident to me that the cultural mestizaje pride, this race mixture pride, notwithstanding, not all parts of the mixture were equally welcomed or celebrated. Even outside of the family nucleus, I found that there was a politics to racial mixture that living in the multi-ethnic New York City of the late 1960s and 1970s did not abate. I was blessed to have attended a very dynamic Bank Street Head Start program located in Midtown West neighborhood of Manhattan, then known as Hell's Kitchen, the backdrop for the play and the movie West Side Story, Jets and Sharks. Now you get the picture, okay? The preschool, though, was incredibly diverse and a delight to attend. However, when we all graduated from preschool and enrolled in the local public elementary school, I was separated from this very diverse group of friends. For the first 2 weeks of first grade, I found myself in a very chaotic classroom where we were often left unattended and where very little learning took place. This was the special education class of the 1960s. The class was filled with brown-skinned Latinos and African Americans I had never met before. I was separated from my best friend, Lizzie, with a very sweet little white Irish face. I was separated from my Puerto Rican buddy, Ruben, with his very pale white skin, nor were any of the other white-skinned Puerto Ricans from the Head Start program in the special education class with me. When my mother discovered that something was not quite right about my elementary learning school situation, she intervened, came to school, had the conversation, and the school officials claimed that I was placed there because of my Spanish language education needs. This was an explanation which was most peculiar, given the English-dominant African Americans in the class, and the absence of any bilingual education while I was there. Back then, there was not a public conversation about the school-to-prison pipeline, but there was certainly a penitentiary approach to warehousing difference. Only when my mother insisted that English was actually my primary language and the language of my instruction in preschool was I able to enter a mainstream classroom where actual teaching took place. Even after my escape, though, from the special ed of the 1960s, which was neither special nor an education, my New York City public school education continued to operate within a pigmentocracy where the racial mixture of Latinos was acknowledged, but closer approximations of whiteness were rewarded with presumptions of competence and intellect. This became especially clear to me when strangers did not know my Spanish surname or ethnic origin and presumed that my black-white mixture was solely due to an African American ancestry. After a lifetime of seeing how my mixed race and multi-ethnic status did not shield me from the racism of our society, nor many others I traveled to, it came as a surprise to me to read the work of scholars proclaiming that mixed race racial discrimination was distinct in nature from the racial discrimination that non-multiracial identified persons experience. Now, certainly every individual person perceives racial discrimination as their own personal experience. But it was still a jolt to encounter the premise that the presumed uniqueness of the discrimination against multiracial identified persons required a whole new approach to civil rights law. Because this presumption is such a disconnect from my own mixed race Puerto Rican experience with race, I began this journey of tracking down the multiracial accounts for myself. The tale of multiracial discrimination and why it's thought to challenge traditional understandings of civil rights law has much to teach us about how to move towards a more egalitarian society. It's my hope that the insights I found in examining the multiracial discrimination cases will be illuminating for you as well, whatever your own story of race may be. So that's the end of the excerpt. Now I want to talk to you sort of zoom back out and talk a little bit more about the bigger issues and besides my own individual stories. I tease that it was all about me, but it's not just all about me. So what I did in the book is I examined all the electronically available anti-discrimination law cases with mixed race identified claimants. And I did this within the context of employment, education, housing, public accommodations, and criminal justice. Right? So there are chapters devoted to each of those spaces. They form the bedrock of civil rights law, so that's why I chose them. What I found in each of these contexts was a story of a very familiar binary of white versus non-white bias. Let me share an example of one of the stories from the book. This is a story about Jill Mitchell. Jill Mitchell is a light-skinned, biracial woman with a black father and a white mother. I'm using her language for how she describes herself. Based on her appearance, she says that many people presume that she's of mixed Hispanic and European descent. She starts working for Champs Sports Texas, a sporting goods chain, as a full-time management trainee. She worked there for about a whole year without any problems, and she actually received a lot of positive performance evaluations, right? Good praise for her work performance. But she felt that her entire work experience was transformed when her store manager discovered that while he could see she was mixed, that there was a part of her ancestry that was African American. Now, why did it take him a whole year to figure this out? You may be wondering. Jill never shared what her ancestry was. She says people could sort of sense that she was mixed, but that when they did that typical question that they ask anyone who looks racially ambiguous or mixed race, so, what are you? She refused to answer. It's none of your business. Right? And she didn't write it on any of her job applications or what have you. So how did he find out a year later? Well, she's working there a whole year. She's comfortable in her workspace. So family start to come by to take her out to lunch, pick her up from work, give her a ride, you know. And there were family members who were darker skinned. When the supervisor finds out that those darker skinned people are actually family and that she's not adopted, he starts to put two and two together. And she is what, you know, some might say she was outed by her family about having African ancestry in the mixed. Okay. So when he deduces, right, this ancestry, she says that his whole attitude towards her changed dramatically. Right? As he started to fixate on her African ancestry. He starts to treat her to a barrage of negative commentary about black people, and on one occasion says to her, you know, you only date black men, like, you know, as if this were problematic. At one point, right, as if that weren't bad enough, right, she overhears this same manager say, we need to get her out of here. So you know what's up. The store manager's racialized treatment of Jill continues until she's eventually demoted, despite all the positive praise for her work performance in the past. And her former position is filled with a white employee who came not from the ranks of the established management trainee program like herself, but instead from the part-time hires. Anybody who knows about working in seniority systems knows that that is a major breach of protocol. As a result, she attributes her demotion to race discrimination, and she files an employment discrimination claim. Now, let me explain something to you on the outset. Her chances for winning her lawsuit were quite low. Not because of the relative merits of her claim or because she's mixed race, but because very few racial discrimination claims ever are successful. And it's a misperception that they are. The vast majority of racial discrimination claims are dismissed by judges without even the opportunity to see a jury. So they don't go to trial, right? They don't lose a trial, they don't get to trial. For judges, it's not about discrimination, it's so that you have a personality conflict, right? So they view it as, this doesn't even warrant moving further for deeper inquiry. From 1979 to 2006, federal claimants only won 15% of job discrimination claims. In comparison to other civil law claims, non-criminal claims, that win rate was 51%, which you'd sort of more expect, like, you know, 50% of the times people like are bringing something that makes sense, 50% of the time they're not. Commentators attribute this very low success rate to the growing hostility with which judges approach allegations of discrimination. Courts seemingly believe that the passage of civil rights law alone has brought a post-racial society in which instances of discrimination are rare. Yet, despite the overarching challenge of trying to persuade a judge that she had actually experienced discrimination, Jill's claim is received with great solicitousness on the part of the judge. Let me explain to you. She files a request for a court-appointed lawyer. You might be familiar with this concept from TV, right? You know, a lot of these TV shows, right? They're criminal cases, and you see that if there's an indigent, a poor client, they are given a court-appointed lawyer. But the legal system only does that in criminal cases because someone's liberty is at stake. We don't do that for any other kind of claim. You can come represent yourself, or you can pay for a lawyer. That's it. Right? If you want to bring a claim about a slip of, you had an accident and somebody was to blame, or you got in a car accident and somebody hit you, right? You bring your own lawyer. So when she asked to have the judge appoint her a lawyer that would be paid for with government funds, this is like unheard of. When I tell my colleagues, they're like, what? The one that she even thought to ask for it, and that the judge grants it. It's incredible. He grants her the request for a court-appointed lawyer. And in doing so, right, he has to assess the merits of her claim. So meaning we're not just going to give you, say yes to this if we think that what you're asking and that your story is completely ludicrous. Like, I'll give you some examples. As a law clerk working for a judge, some claims that I saw come before the judge were claims like, someone has brought aliens from outer space and they've infiltrated my telephone system and now I'm getting radiation. Now, I'm not saying that's not true, but you would see where a judge would be skeptical about those kind of claims. Right? So, all kinds of claims come before judges. I'm not saying every claim is a meritorious one, right? But okay. So the judge has to assess, does this claim have any basis, right? And before saying yes or no to her request for a lawyer, he says yes, that the merits of her allegations weigh in favor of granting the motion. Right? So he's simultaneously endorsing the merits of her claim and authorizing government funds for her lawyer. Right? Having a lawyer represent you and be able to professionally research your story and bring law to bear, right, levels the playing field. Right? Employers, they have a lawyer on retainer, right? They've got contract issues. They have all sorts of issues. They always have a lawyer. They're what we call repeat players, right? They're not new to the rodeo. They're here all the time as far as the legal sphere is concerned, right? So they're always advantaged. When someone bringing an employment discrimination claim has a lawyer, that now is like a whole new kind of interaction between the two sides. Right? And sure enough, once she obtains a lawyer, a confidential settlement agreement is reached in the case. Right? The other side never wants to talk to you about money until, right, you've got a lawyer. And not just any lawyer, also the stamp of approval from the court suggesting, I think there's something worth investigating here. Right? That's a signal, oh, this is not going to be an easy case to win. Okay. So in short, what does this little foray into her experience in the courts suggest to you? This was not a judge who was confused by her biracial identity. And she was able to actually use the law as it currently exists to reach a satisfactory resolution of her case. So at its core, right, Jill Mitchell's story is one about the societal bias against all non-whiteness rather than an anti-racial mixture bias. And that's the pattern in all the multiracial discrimination claims of discrimination that I examined across various legal contexts and across diverse ethnicities and racial ancestries, right? So it's not just about blackness, although it is in large part about blackness, but it's not only about blackness. During the Q&A, I can tell you stories about the Filipinos who filed claims and Latinos, etc. So for this reason, the objective of my book is to elucidate the distinction between the presumed exceptional space that multiracials are rhetorically imagined to occupy in this public discourse and the white versus non-white racial realities that they actually experience when they are discriminated against. Right? Discrimination is not a subtle phenomena. It's crude. It flows in this binary way. In fact, the book attempts to illustrate that the claim for multiracial exceptionalism in law is deeply flawed and misses the continuing power of racial hierarchy and privilege, and thereby actually poses a danger to equality. And this is evident in the legal challenges to race-based affirmative action over the last 10 years, where the Supreme Court has positioned mixed-race persons as undermining the societal need for racial remediation. The compilation of stories in the book disrupts this Supreme Court notion and shows that multiracials are not an exception to the white versus non-white dynamic of racism, and instead are being invoked as a tool to dismantle the protections of civil rights law. Now, some of you might be thinking, the multiracial sort of idea of discrimination being about any resistance to multiracial identity. Right? Because you may be wondering, this woman wins her claim, what do they view as problematic about her assertion, right? And how she navigates it in courts? Like, why is this an example that multiracial identified scholars point to as a problematic case? When the judge, as he is saying her case is one that is worth further inquiry and warrants the dedication of government sources to pay for a lawyer, after he describes how she identifies herself, he then uses a shortcut. And his shortcut is to refer to her as black. He only refers to her as black. And for multiracial identity scholars, that oversimplification of her more fluid and nuanced identity, right, is itself an issue of discrimination. And more importantly, they say that that oversimplification on the part of the judge means that he wasn't able to see how she was truly discriminated against, that this has confused them and they don't understand, can't appreciate, and thus cannot adequately apply the law. Well, here's the interesting thing. Jill's use of her story, right? I mean, and it's her story, right? It's not a lawyer's story. The lawyer comes in later. Everything I told you about her story was from her own words, right? Because she files these petitions before she's got a lawyer to help her tell her own story. So these are her words. So when she files her story, she describes herself as, multiracial, identified. She uses the language of biraciality. But then everything about the discrimination is all about the references to her blackness. Meaning, the blackness is what she raises up herself as the trigger for the discrimination she experienced. Right? Meaning, she's the one making it salient. So when a judge responds to the person telling a story about what they find as the salient aspect of the discrimination, certainly it would be better for judges to be appropriate in reflecting back to someone the identity description that they use for themselves. I'm not challenging that. I agree. But does it mean that the judge does not readily understand what happened as far as discrimination law is concerned? I suggest these are two separate spheres. Right? And that the focus on the first, I wasn't referred to by the racial label I want for myself when the judge was analyzing the facts of the claim, that is an approach to law that I like to call personal identity equality, right? Because it's all just about the identity and not about the actual manifestation of the discrimination. Right? And some of you might think, well, what's the problem, Professor? Why can't we address the issues of personal identity equality at the same time that we deal with group-based manifestations of discrimination, which is what you see happening to poor Jill Mitchell, right? She's discriminated against not because of the uniqueness of her identity, but because the employer now thinks you're black, or you're tainted by blackness, and now I have no more use for you in my workplace. So you might think that this is not an incompatible juxtaposition, the personal sort of identity equality, right, of the multiracial identified scholars and that of the traditional group-based material inequality approach to civil rights. Yet, in my view, this concept of personal identity equality is not so innocuous when it interferes with the ability to identify and address the material inequality that individuals are exposed to apart from their personal identity. Right? A significant deficit of the personal identity view of civil rights is its abstraction away from articulating institutional forms of racism and the pervasiveness of white supremacy. When the personal individual identity focus of this multiracial social movement is transplanted into the legal context, it obstructs the ability to understand the needs of multiracial victims of discrimination from the white versus non-white group-based hierarchies. This disserves the needs of multiracial people who are experiencing discrimination. Moreover, the rhetoric of personal identity equality has come to be used in ways that undermine the enforcement of anti-discrimination law in very harmful ways. So before I close and open up to a Q&A, I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. Supreme Court Justice Roberts, right, directly posed questions regarding the implication of mixed-race candidates for affirmative action programs when the UT Austin consideration of race affirmative action plan was challenged in 2013. In the oral arguments for what was Fisher 1, because we keep coming back to this stuff, Fisher 1, Justice Roberts questioned how compelling the university pursuit of a diverse student body could be if a candidate was, and here are his words, 1/4 Hispanic or 1/8 Hispanic, if that person's allowed to identify on the admissions application as Hispanic without the university verifying the veracity of the racial identification. The admissions office people in the room might find this very scary. For Justice Roberts, mixed-race applicants are a cause for generating skepticism about the integrity and ability of affirmative action to truly achieve racial diversity. And nor is the skepticism limited to Justice Roberts. When the Supreme Court re-examined the UT Austin affirmative action policy in Fisher 2, two other Supreme Court justices joined Roberts in raising concerns about the viability of affirmative action in light of multiracial identified applicants. In Fisher 2, Justices Alito and Roberts and Thomas joined in an opinion that opines that the affirmative action program was faulty because, and here I'm quoting them, as racial and ethnic prejudice recedes, more and more students will have parents or grandparents who fall into more than one of UT's 5 enumerated racial groups. The presumption is that the increase in multiracial identified applicants undermines both the implementation and justification for affirmative action. And this idea did not originate with the justices. As with Grutter and Gratz litigation in Michigan a decade earlier, the challenge to the UT's affirmative action program was replete with opposition papers referencing the presumed exceptionality and significance of mixed-race applicants in the pool. What each of the foregoing examples demonstrates is the influence of the multiracial identity discourse and how it has had on justifying challenges to policies of racial inclusion, even in cases where the Supreme Court has endorsed the constitutionality of affirmative action, while at the same time imposing constraints on its use. So especially alarming then is the Supreme Court's reference again to mixed-race persons in its decision of authorizing outright state bans on affirmative action. Here I'm referring to the Schuett versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action, where the court held that a public ballot initiated amendment to the Michigan State Constitution could ban affirmative action at all public universities, and that this would not be state action that inflicts injury on racial minorities in violation of the Constitution. In assessing the ballot initiative in the Schuett case, and whether it was intended to harm racial minorities, what else would it be for? But anyway, Justice Kennedy asserted in the court opinion of the majority that, and here I'm quoting him, in a society in which those racial lines are becoming more blurred, the attempt to define race-based categories raises serious questions of its own. In short, over 2 decades of multiracial discourse situating mixed race persons as racially unique and emblematic of racial progress has bolstered the opposition to policies of racial inclusion and provided opponents additional fodder for their argumentation. Rhetoric has consequences. Indeed, the Supreme Court affirmative action litigation references to mixed race persons has paralleled the public discourse notion that the growth of multiracial identified persons signals the decline of racism. Only a direct challenge to the personal identity equality perspective, right, like the one comprised by my book, has the potential to more effectively pursue racial equality, because impurity and hybridity in of themselves are no guaranteed challenge to the racial order of white supremacy. Now, let me end by saying that while I talk about the binary between whiteness and non-whiteness, there are also cases in the book where there are no white identified people. Right? Meaning, this binary is not one that is exclusive, right, to white people. That is to say that there are plenty of cases in the book where those who would view as only people of color, like say in a workplace where it's all people of color identified employees, there can still be a binary between whiteness and non-whiteness. In what way? In whiteness being elevated. Right? So in those cases where a mixed race person is saying, the black identified co-workers are racially harassing me, that too fits this analytical frame that I'm describing to you. And actually those cases win. They go to court, they don't even settle. They go to court and they win. You want to know more about that? I'll tell you about it during the Q&A. So I wanted to say three last things. There are multiple purposes for the book. As you might imagine from just this little description I've given to you today. One, of course, I want to intervene into this conversation, and so it's for the public at large. Two, I want to be able to educate lawyers and judges. So, what does it mean to have a growing multiracial population in applying anti-discrimination law? I'm trying to situate their brains so that they know how to appropriately address these claims. And I want to offer up the stories in the book to instructors in universities who are addressing issues of discrimination and racial identity and racial formation in sociology, in American civilization, in American studies, in political science. Right? It's a book that's meant to both speak to people individually, but also could be used for teaching purposes. And indeed, there's an instructor's guide that is electronically available for free to people who are using it for use in a classroom.